My name is Catherine Blake. I'm 32 years old, and if you had asked me 3 months ago whether I was in an emotionally abusive relationship, I would have laughed at the question. Not because the signs weren't there, because they had become normal to me. That's the terrifying part about emotional manipulation. It rarely arrives all at once. It happens slowly, quietly, one compromise at a time, until you stop recognizing yourself inside your own life. My boyfriend Liam and I had been together for almost 2.5 years. In the beginning, he was charming in that intense kind of way that makes you feel chosen. He remembered tiny details about me. He brought me coffee exactly the way I liked it. He'd hold my hand in public like he was afraid to lose me in a crowd. And honestly, I loved that feeling. I loved feeling important to someone. But somewhere along the line, love quietly turned into management. Management of his moods. Management of his reactions. Management of every sentence that came out of my mouth. At first, the changes were small enough that I kept excusing them. If I spent too much time with my friends, he became distant for days. If I disagreed with him publicly, he'd accuse me of embarrassing him. If I didn't text back quickly enough, he'd suddenly start talking about whether we were still compatible. Every conflict somehow ended with me apologizing for things I didn't even fully understand. About a month before the trip, Liam threatened to leave me because I refused to cancel dinner plans with my college friends. I gave in. At the time, I told myself it was because he was stressed from work. Looking back now, I realized that was the exact moment I should have understood what was happening. Because people who love you do not constantly place the relationship on a cliff edge to force obedience. That isn't love. That's conditioning. The vacation was supposed to fix things. At least, that's what I told myself. I booked us an all-inclusive resort in Punta Cana after receiving a decent performance bonus from work. I paid for everything because I genuinely believed maybe we just needed rest. Maybe we needed sunlight and distance from everyday stress. Maybe we needed to remember who we used to be. The morning of the flight actually started peacefully. Liam kissed my forehead while we waited for coffee at the airport. He joked with me in line at security. For a little while, it almost felt normal again. And that's the dangerous thing about unhealthy relationships. The good moments keep you emotionally invested long after the bad moments should have pushed you away. Everything changed at the gate. We were waiting to board when Liam looked at our seat assignments. An aisle seat and a middle seat. Not ideal, obviously. But the flight was packed when I booked the tickets. There weren't many options left. The second he saw the boarding passes, his entire face changed. "You seriously couldn't pay extra for better seats?" he asked sharply. I felt my stomach tighten immediately. That feeling had become automatic around him. Like my nervous system already knew a storm was coming before my brain caught up. "I tried," I said quietly. This was honestly the best available option. He laughed once under his breath. "Catherine, this is exactly what I mean when I say you don't think about my comfort." People nearby started glancing over. I lowered my voice instinctively. "We can ask the gate agent if there's anything available." "But you should have already handled it." There it was. That tone. The one that meant he was building toward something. I could practically predict the rhythm by then.
Disappointment. Criticism. Emotional escalation. Punishment.
Then the ultimatum finally arrived. He crossed his arms and looked directly at me. "Either you go up there right now and fix these seats," he said coldly, "or I'm seriously reconsidering this relationship." The confidence in his expression almost hurt more than the threat itself, because he genuinely believed I would panic. And honestly, normally I would have. Normally, I would have rushed to solve the problem. I would have apologized. I would have tried to calm him down before the situation became bigger. But something inside me broke in the quietest possible way. Not dramatically, not angrily, just clearly. I suddenly realized I had heard some version of this threat dozens of times. Threats over vacations. Threats over social plans. Threats over arguments. Threats over tiny disappointments. Every disagreement carried the possibility of emotional abandonment unless I complied fast enough. And standing there in that airport, holding my boarding pass while strangers pretended not to listen, I finally understood something horrifying. I was exhausted. Not physically.
spiritually, emotionally.
I looked at him for a long moment and said softly, "Okay." His expression instantly changed. "What?" "If that's what you want," I replied calmly, "then okay." For the first time in months, Liam looked genuinely confused, then panicked. "No, Catherine, don't do that," he said quickly. "You know I didn't mean it like that." But I could hear it now. The shift, the backtracking, the sudden fear once the tactics stopped working. "I'm stressed about flying," he continued rapidly. "Why are you making this into something bigger?" And maybe that's the hardest part to explain to people who've never experienced manipulation like this. The panic in his eyes told me more truth than anything else he said afterward. Because it was never about the seats. It was about control. And for the first time, he wasn't controlling me anymore. We boarded the plane in silence. During the flight, he kept trying to reopen the conversation. "Can we just reset? You're seriously overreacting. You know relationships take compromise." But I put my headphones on and stared out the window. Not to punish him. To protect myself. Because deep down, I knew if I started negotiating emotionally again, I would fall right back into the same cycle. The cycle where I apologized for his behavior. The cycle where peace always depended on my surrender. At some point, Liam stopped trying to talk. He sat stiffly beside me for the rest of the flight, occasionally glancing over like he was waiting for me to crack first. I didn't. When we landed in Punta Cana, I calmly told him I'd be getting my own room. That was the moment he realized the breakup was real. At the resort lobby, he immediately switched strategies. Suddenly, he was smiling too hard, acting casual, suggesting we forget the airport fight and enjoy the vacation. But when I quietly repeated that we were no longer together, he exploded. Right there in front of the front desk staff. "You're ruining this entire trip over nothing!" he snapped loudly. Several people turned to stare. "You're embarrassing me." I remember feeling strangely calm watching him unravel publicly. Like I was finally seeing the relationship from outside myself instead of inside it. I politely asked the receptionist if I could speak privately. I explained the relationship had ended and that I no longer felt comfortable sharing a room. The staff were surprisingly kind. They moved me to another building entirely and even upgraded the room. Meanwhile, Liam stood across the lobby, staring at me like he no longer recognized me. Honestly, I barely recognized myself either. A few hours later, I sat alone on the balcony of my new room, listening to the ocean. My phone buzzed constantly. Texts from Liam. "I didn't mean it. You're throwing away everything. You're being dramatic. You know I love you." But underneath all of it, I felt something unexpected.
Relief.
Real relief. Like I had been holding my breath for years without realizing it. For the first time in months, I wasn't waiting for his mood to shift. I wasn't monitoring my tone carefully. I wasn't trying to predict emotional landmines before stepping on them. I was just breathing. And somewhere, deep down, that terrified me almost as much as the breakup itself. Because relief should never be the strongest emotion you feel after leaving someone you supposedly love. The next morning, I woke up disoriented for a few seconds. Not because of the breakup. Because of the silence. There was no tension sitting beside me in bed. No pressure to immediately evaluate someone else's mood before even opening my eyes. No anxiety about whether the day would begin peacefully or explode without warning. Just sunlight, ocean air, and quiet. I stood on the balcony for almost 20 minutes holding a cup of coffee, trying to understand why peace suddenly felt unfamiliar. That realization stayed with me the entire morning. The strange thing about emotionally draining relationships is that chaos becomes your baseline. Your nervous system adapts to it. You stop noticing how tightly wound you are until the tension finally disappears. Part of me still expected Liam to somehow smooth everything over. Not because I wanted him back. Because that had always been our pattern.
Explosion. Apology. Temporary calm.
Repeat. But by noon, it became obvious he had no intention of respecting the breakup. Everywhere I went, he appeared. At the pool. At the outdoor cafe. Near the beach entrance. At first, he pretended the encounters were accidental. "Oh, wow," he said, with fake amusement, when he appeared beside my chair near the pool. "We keep running into each other." I barely looked up from my book. "Mm-hmm. You're really going to stay angry this whole trip?" "I'm not angry," I said calmly. That answer visibly irritated him because it denied him the emotional confrontation he wanted. "You're acting cold." "No," I replied quietly. "I'm acting done." The expression on his face hardened immediately. That switch used to scare me. The instant emotional temperature change whenever he lost control of a conversation. But now that I could finally see the pattern clearly, it felt less intimidating and more sad. By the afternoon, I started intentionally moving around the resort to avoid him. It didn't matter. He kept finding me anyway. Around lunchtime, I escaped to a beach bar near the far side of the property, hoping he wouldn't follow me there. That's where everything shifted unexpectedly. At the table beside mine sat a large wedding group from Chicago. They were loud, in the warm, happy way emotionally healthy people usually are. Laughing too hard, sharing appetizers, teasing each other without cruelty hiding underneath it. One of the women accidentally bumped my chair while turning around. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," she laughed. "It's okay," I smiled. That tiny interaction somehow turned into conversation. Within 15 minutes, they'd pulled another chair into their circle for me, like I'd known them for years. It felt strange at first. I realized I'd become so emotionally isolated inside my relationship that casual kindness almost felt suspicious. One of the groomsmen introduced himself as Daniel Hayes. 34. Soft-spoken, warm eyes, calm energy. The kind of man who listened without trying to dominate every conversation. At some point, someone jokingly asked if I was there alone. I hesitated. Then I gave them the short version. "My boyfriend and I broke up at the airport yesterday." Several people winced immediately. "Oof," one bridesmaid muttered. Daniel studied me quietly for a second before asking gently, "Messy breakup?" I laughed once under my breath. "You have no idea." There was something deeply comforting about how nobody pressured me to explain more than I wanted to. No judgment. No interrogation. Just normal conversation afterward. I hadn't realized how much I missed that. Then Liam appeared. Of course he did. I saw Daniel's eyes flick past my shoulder first. Then he leaned slightly closer and said quietly, "Your ex-boyfriend has been staring at this table for like 5 minutes." I turned. Liam stood across the pool deck, pretending to check his phone while openly watching us. The second our eyes met, he started walking over. I felt exhaustion settle into my chest immediately. Not fear. Just exhaustion. He approached the table, smiling tightly. "Well," he said, looking directly at Daniel, "this looks cozy." Nobody answered. Liam looked at me. "So this is what you're doing now?" "I'm having lunch." "With random men?" There it was again. That subtle attempt to frame himself as the victim while quietly establishing ownership over me. Before, I would have immediately tried calming the situation. Now, I just felt detached. "We're broken up, Liam." His jaw tightened. "You keep saying that like this isn't some ridiculous overreaction." Daniel calmly took a sip of his drink without looking intimidated at all. Honestly, that alone seemed to irritate Liam even more. He turned toward the table. "She does this thing where she exaggerates everything emotionally." I almost laughed hearing him say that. Because for 2.5 years, he had convinced me I was the emotional one. Meanwhile, he was the person threatening breakups over airplane seats. One of the bridesmaids spoke carefully. "She told us you guys ended things already." Liam immediately pointed at me. "Because she's being dramatic." That word again.
Dramatic. Crazy. Emotional.
Every manipulative person eventually starts rewriting reality by attacking your reactions instead of addressing their behavior. I finally stood up. Not angrily, just firmly. "No," I said clearly enough for nearby people to hear. "We broke up because you repeatedly used the relationship as leverage every time you didn't get your way." The entire pool area suddenly felt quieter. Liam stared at me like he couldn't believe I was speaking openly. I kept going. You threatened to leave me in the airport because you didn't like the seat assignments. His face flushed instantly. That's not what happened. It is exactly what happened. You're twisting this. No, I replied softly. I'm finally saying it out loud. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, Daniel quietly said something that completely changed the atmosphere. You know, he said evenly, people in healthy relationships usually don't threaten abandonment during minor inconveniences. Simple.
Calm.
But devastatingly accurate. I watched Liam realize in real time that the social narrative wasn't working anymore. He couldn't charm the situation. He couldn't isolate me. He couldn't privately pressure me into doubting myself because there were witnesses now. Too many people watching. Too many people seeing the behavior clearly. His expression darkened immediately. You have no idea what she's actually like, he snapped toward Daniel. Daniel shrugged calmly. Maybe not, but I know controlling behavior when I see it. That sentence landed like a slap. Liam looked back at me with something close to hatred flashing across his face. Not heartbreak. Not sadness.
Rage.
Because control was slipping. You're seriously humiliating me right now, he hissed. I grabbed my towel slowly. No, Liam, I said quietly. You humiliated yourself. Then I walked away. For the first few seconds, I expected him to follow me again. He didn't. And honestly, that scared me more. Because suddenly the emotional mask had cracked enough for me to glimpse the resentment underneath it. The wedding group found me again later near the beach. This time, nobody treated me delicately. Nobody acted awkward. They simply included me. Like a normal person. And weirdly, that almost made me emotional. That night, they invited me to attend the wedding ceremony because several guests had canceled last minute. I almost said no. Then I realized something painful. For months, I had been saying no to almost everything that didn't revolve around Liam's comfort. So I went. The ceremony took place on the beach just before sunset. Soft music. String lights.
Ocean wind.
Simple happiness. And standing there, watching two people look at each other with genuine emotional safety instead of tension and power struggles, something inside me cracked a little. Not in a bad way. In a grieving way. Because I realized I had spent years confusing emotional instability with passion. I stood there, quietly staring at the waves while everyone celebrated around me. Daniel eventually walked over, holding 2 drinks. You okay? He asked gently. Honestly? I laughed softly. I don't know yet. He nodded like he understood exactly what I meant. For the next few hours, we talked about everything, except relationships. Music.
Travel.
Family. Work disasters. Childhood stories. And the entire time, I kept waiting for the emotional pressure I'd grown used to. The subtle criticism. The manipulation. The tension. It never came. Talking to him felt easy. Safe.
Steady.
At one point, he smiled and said quietly, You keep apologizing before finishing your sentences. I blinked. What? You say sorry constantly, he said gently, even when nobody's upset. That hit me harder than I expected, because I hadn't even realized I was doing it anymore. The next morning at breakfast, Liam saw Daniel and me sitting together near the restaurant windows. He didn't approach us. He just stared. Cold.
Silent.
His expression looked almost hollow now. Later that afternoon, I discovered he'd changed his flight home. 2 days early. For a few brief hours, I actually believed that meant the nightmare was over. I thought maybe he finally understood. Maybe he finally accepted the relationship was done. I had no idea the hardest part was still waiting for me back home. When I got home the following Sunday, I expected silence. An empty driveway. An empty house. Maybe some leftover tension lingering emotionally in the walls, but physically? I thought Liam would be gone. Instead, I opened the front door and found him sitting comfortably on my living room couch, watching television, like nothing had happened. For a second, I genuinely thought I was hallucinating from exhaustion. He looked up calmly and smiled. "Hey," he said casually. "How was your flight?" I remember just standing there with my suitcase still in my hand, staring at him while my brain tried to catch up. We had been living together for about 5 months. Well, technically, he had slowly moved himself into my house over time. A drawer became a closet. A few overnight stays became entire weeks. Then suddenly his mail started arriving there, and somehow my house no longer fully felt like mine anymore. The property was entirely under my name.
Mortgage.
Utilities. Insurance. Everything. But apparently that didn't matter as much legally as I thought it would. Because Liam had established residency. And residency came with rights. He muted the television and stood up slowly. "I've had time to think," he said carefully. "And honestly, I think we both handled things badly." There it was immediately. Not accountability. Shared blame. Manipulative people love shared blame because it dilutes responsibility until nobody is clearly at fault anymore. I set my suitcase down quietly. "We're still broken up." His smile faltered slightly. "Catherine, no." He sighed dramatically and rubbed his forehead like I was being unreasonable. "You're seriously still doing this?" That sentence almost made me laugh. Doing this. As though ending a toxic relationship was some temporary emotional episode I would eventually calm down from. "I need my key back," I said firmly. The softness vanished from his face instantly. "I live here. You lived here." "No," he snapped. "I live here now." That conversation lasted less than 10 minutes before turning into one of the most emotionally disorienting experiences of my life. Because Liam somehow managed to act simultaneously furious, wounded, affectionate, betrayed, and dismissive all within the same conversation. It was emotional whiplash. Eventually, I called my friend Vanessa. Vanessa Ruiz had been one of my closest friends since college and now worked as a housing attorney. After hearing the situation, she became very quiet. Then she asked one devastating question. "Has he been receiving mail there?" My stomach dropped. "Yes." Another pause. "Catherine, legally, you can't just throw him out." That was the moment I realized the breakup wasn't actually over. Not even close. Vanessa explained that because Liam had been living there more than 30 days and receiving official mail at the property, he now had tenant protections, despite not being on the mortgage. Meaning I would have to formally evict my own ex-boyfriend from my own house. I remember hanging up the phone afterward and feeling physically sick. Meanwhile, Liam walked around upstairs making coffee like everything was perfectly normal. That night, I moved into the basement guest room. Not because I was scared of him physically, because I suddenly understood I needed emotional distance immediately. I locked my office, moved important documents downstairs, installed temporary locks on storage rooms. And for the first time in my adult life, I no longer felt emotionally safe inside my own home. That's the part people don't fully understand about manipulative relationships. Even after they end, the pressure doesn't stop immediately. Sometimes it gets worse because boundaries threaten the control dynamic. Over the next several days, Liam completely changed tactics. At the resort, he had used anger. At home, he used performance. He cooked elaborate dinners, bought my favorite coffee creamer, folded laundry I never asked him to touch. One evening, I came upstairs to find candles lit across the kitchen table. He smiled softly. "I made your favorite pasta." I stared at the setup, feeling almost disconnected from reality. Because if someone walked into that kitchen without context, they would have thought they were witnessing a devoted boyfriend trying to save his relationship. But I knew the truth underneath it. None of it was about love. It was about access. Access to my emotions. Access to my sympathy. Access to my guilt. "I already ordered takeout," I said quietly. His expression immediately darkened. "I spent 2 hours cooking." "I didn't ask you to." The old Catherine would have appreciated the effort. That sentence sat in the air heavily. The old Catherine. Meaning the version of me who constantly prioritized his feelings over my own emotional safety. I walked back downstairs without responding. About 20 minutes later, I heard him slamming cabinet doors upstairs. The emotional punishment phase had begun again. A few days later, things got even stranger. My mother called me, sounding confused. "Sweetheart," she said carefully, "Liam told me you two are just going through a rough patch." I closed my eyes immediately. "No, Mom, we broke up." Long silence. "Oh." Apparently, Liam had been contacting my family behind my back, reframing the breakup as a temporary misunderstanding, while presenting himself as the patient, heartbroken boyfriend trying to repair things. Then he started interacting with my friends online, liking old photos, sending emotional messages, commenting supportive things under posts to maintain emotional presence inside my social circle. It felt invasive, like he was trying to keep one hand wrapped around every part of my life simultaneously. And then came the realization that truly frightened me. I started suspecting he was going through my belongings. I keep important documents in a fireproof safe downstairs in my office. One afternoon, I noticed the dial sitting at a slightly different angle than I remembered leaving it. Maybe it sounds paranoid. But once trust fully breaks, your nervous system notices tiny things. I called Vanessa immediately. She came over that evening under the excuse of checking legal paperwork, but really she wanted to observe Liam directly herself. At first, he performed beautifully. The second she arrived downstairs, his entire personality softened. "Vanessa," he said warmly, "I'm glad you're here, honestly. Catherine and I are just struggling with communication right now." Communication. Not manipulation. Not emotional threats. Not refusal to leave my property. Communication. Vanessa remained completely expressionless. Liam sat beside me on the couch like we were a united couple attending therapy. "I love her," he said quietly. "I think she's just overwhelmed emotionally." The sheer audacity of hearing him calmly describe me as emotionally unstable after months of manipulation nearly made me dizzy. Then he turned toward me with carefully softened eyes. "Baby, I already found a couples therapist. We can still fix this." Vanessa finally spoke. "Mr. Carter," she said evenly, "Catherine has formally ended the relationship and served notice requiring you to vacate the property. This is no longer a relationship discussion. It's a legal housing matter." For one split second, Liam's mask slipped completely. Pure fury flashed across his face so quickly, most people might have missed it. But I saw it. Vanessa saw it too. Then instantly, he transformed again.
Confused expression.
Soft voice. "I don't understand why everyone's treating me like a criminal for loving my girlfriend." Ex-girlfriend, I thought immediately. But the fact he refused to even use the correct word suddenly felt important, because acknowledging the breakup meant acknowledging loss of control. Vanessa stood calmly. "Catherine asked you to leave," she said. "You need to respect that." Liam looked at me silently for several long seconds. Then he smiled. A cold, exhausted kind of smile. "You know what?" he said quietly. "I think your friends are poisoning you against me." That sentence chilled me more than yelling would have. Because manipulative people often frame boundaries as outside corruption, as though nobody could independently choose to leave them without being influenced. After Vanessa left, she pulled me aside near the driveway. "You need to document everything now," she said quietly. "Do you think he's dangerous?" She hesitated. "I think he's losing control of the situation. That's when people become unpredictable." That night, I barely slept. Every sound upstairs made me tense. Not because I thought Liam would attack me physically, because emotional unpredictability creates its own kind of fear. The next morning, I called my longtime friend Natalie and asked if she could stay over occasionally until Liam moved out. She agreed immediately. Then, I ordered security cameras for the common areas of the house. Nothing dramatic. Just protection. Just evidence. Just enough to ensure reality couldn't be rewritten later. Because by then, I finally understood something terrifying. The relationship hadn't ended at the airport. That was only the moment I stopped surrendering. The real war started after he realized I meant it. The final week of Liam's eviction notice felt emotionally surreal. By then, the house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a waiting room before some unavoidable disaster. Natalie stayed over several nights each week, like Vanessa recommended. And honestly, having another person there changed everything. The tension in the house shifted any time there was a witness around. Liam became more careful, more controlled, which somehow made him feel even more unsettling. One moment, he acted heartbreakingly calm, speaking softly about memories and future plans, like the breakup wasn't real. The next moment, he'd stare at me with this quiet resentment simmering underneath his expression whenever he thought I wasn't looking. It felt like living beside a storm, pretending to be human. Wednesday night, Natalie and I were downstairs watching television when we heard Liam talking loudly upstairs on the phone. At first, I tried ignoring it. Then I realized he was speaking just loudly enough for us to hear.
Deliberately.
"He's turned everyone against me," he said bitterly to whoever was on the other line. "Her friends poisoned her head." Natalie slowly muted the television. I remember feeling my stomach tighten immediately. Then Liam laughed quietly upstairs. "Don't worry," he said. "I still have one more card to play." The words sent a cold wave through my chest. Natalie looked at me. "What does that mean?" "I don't know," I whispered. But deep down, I think I already knew. Because manipulative people rarely surrender quietly when control disappears. They escalate. Thursday arrived. The final day. Legally, Liam had to be gone by midnight. Oddly enough, he seemed almost peaceful that morning. He sat at the kitchen island drinking coffee, while sunlight came through the windows like nothing abnormal was happening. "You sleep okay?" he asked casually. I stayed standing near the doorway. "Are you packed?" He smiled faintly. Eventually, every answer felt loaded with something hidden underneath it. The entire day crawled by painfully slowly. I heard movement upstairs occasionally, but barely any actual packing sounds. No moving boxes. No urgency. Just silence. Around 8 that evening, Vanessa texted me, reminding me not to engage emotionally, no matter what happened. That message stayed in my head all night. Because by then, I understood something important. Liam's strongest weapon had never been anger. It was emotional destabilization.
Confusion.
Fear.
Guilt. Pressure.
If he could trigger enough emotional panic inside me, eventually I'd cave just to make the discomfort stop. That had been our entire relationship dynamic. At around 11 p.m., I finally walked upstairs. Liam sat on the couch, fully dressed, with one suitcase beside him, scrolling calmly through his phone. That image still feels strange in my memory. Like someone waiting at an airport gate, instead of leaving the life they'd shared with someone for years. "You're cutting it close," I said quietly. "My ride's coming." I nodded once. No argument. No fight. That almost made the situation feel worse. At around 11:40, headlights appeared through the front window. Liam stood slowly and grabbed the suitcase handle. For one brief second, I thought maybe that was it. Maybe he was finally going to leave peacefully. Then he turned toward me. And I saw it immediately. That look. The one people get right before they try to wound you emotionally on purpose. "You know," he said softly, "I genuinely thought you were different." I stayed silent. "I thought you were the kind of woman who fought for love." There it was. The guilt. The reframing. Turning my boundaries into cruelty. But this time, the words didn't land the same way anymore. He stepped slightly closer. "You give up the second relationships become difficult." I almost laughed hearing that. Because for 2.5 years, I had fought constantly. Fought to communicate better. Fought to avoid conflict. Fought to stabilize his emotions. Fought to save us over and over again. The only thing I had finally stopped fighting for was my own exhaustion. "I'm not doing this tonight," I said quietly. Something hardened in his face immediately. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. "This is why you should be careful throwing people away, Catherine." He turned the screen toward me. My stomach dropped. Screenshots. Private text conversations from months earlier. Messages where I vented about work stress. Comments about my difficult supervisor. Fragments of emotional conversations completely stripped of context. There were also cropped photos. Pictures carefully edited to make innocent moments look inappropriate or unstable. I felt ice spread through my chest. Liam watched my reaction carefully, and suddenly, I understood. This was the final card. I was thinking, he said calmly, maybe your company would find some of these interesting. I stared at him silently. Maybe your boss, too. The old fear surged up instantly. Raw.
Automatic.
The instinct to immediately de-escalate. To apologize. To negotiate. To make the threat stop before it exploded. For one horrible second, I almost became the old version of myself again. And Liam saw it happen. I watched hope flicker across his face. Because he thought he still had me. Then, something inside me finally settled. Not anger. Not courage. Just clarity. I looked directly at him and said quietly, "Go ahead." His expression faltered. "What?" "Post them." Silence. "Send them to my boss. Send them to my family. Do whatever you think you need to do." For the first time all night, he looked uncertain. "You think people won't believe me?" "I think anyone who truly knows me will." That answer visibly destabilized him, because it denied him the emotional panic he expected. I stepped closer, calmly. "And anyone willing to believe manipulated screenshots without asking me for context was never really in my corner to begin with." The rage arrived instantly after that. Real rage. Not the controlled emotional performance he usually used. Pure fury. "You think you're so much better than everyone," he snapped. "No," I said quietly. "I just finally stopped being afraid of you." That sentence hit him harder than anything else could have. Because fear had always been the foundation underneath his control. Fear of abandonment. Fear of conflict. Fear of emotional punishment. Fear of becoming the villain in his story. And suddenly, none of it worked anymore. "You're going to regret this," he hissed. I shook my head slowly. "No, Liam. I think staying would have been the thing I regretted." For several long seconds, he just stared at me, searching for another opening. Another weakness. Another emotional button to press. But there wasn't one left. Finally, he grabbed the suitcase handle hard enough for his knuckles to turn white. "This isn't over." "Yes," I said softly. "It is." Then he walked out the front door. I watched through the window as he got into the waiting car and disappeared into the darkness. And the strangest thing happened afterward. The house changed instantly. Not physically.
Energetically.
The constant low-level anxiety humming beneath everything simply vanished. No tension. No anticipation. No emotional surveillance. Just silence. Real silence. I locked the front door and stood there for almost a full minute staring at it. Then I cried. Not because I missed him. Because I finally understood how exhausted I'd been. Vanessa called shortly afterward to check on me. When I told her Liam was gone, she actually laughed softly with relief. "You got your house back," she said. But honestly, it wasn't just the house. It was my nervous system. My peace. My ability to exist without constantly monitoring someone else's emotions. The next morning, I made breakfast in my kitchen, wearing oversized pajamas while music played quietly in the background. Nobody criticized what I ate. Nobody analyzed my tone. Nobody acted wounded because I wanted quiet in the morning. It sounds small, but after years of emotional tension, tiny freedoms feel enormous. As for Daniel, we kept texting after the trip. Nothing rushed. Nothing dramatic. Honestly, I wasn't ready for anything serious yet. But talking to him felt steady. And after everything with Liam, steady suddenly felt beautiful. The biggest lesson I took from all of this is something I wish more people understood early. Manipulation rarely starts loudly. It starts with tiny emotional punishments. Tiny ultimatums. Tiny moments where keeping the peace slowly becomes more important than honoring your own feelings. Then one day you wake up and realize you've been surviving instead of living. The airport seats were never actually about seats. They were simply the moment I finally stopped negotiating with emotional threats. Because the truth is, Liam was always going to escalate eventually. The more I surrendered, the more he learned pressure worked. Until one of two things happened. Either I completely disappeared inside the relationship, or I finally stood up and walked away. I'm grateful every day that I eventually chose myself.